Racism. The word racism is a Janus word, see section 3.8, whose evaluative face predominates. Calling someone or something racist automatically condemns him or it. When he says evaluative, he means implying worth or value as opposed to describing something objectively. Like, you can call someone racist and mean that person considers themselves superior to people or to an individual of another race just because of skin color. And that would be, judging their character. But you could also say that they're racist in the sense that they view different races as having different characteristics that are caused by genes, which is very objective and not moral in any way. It's just observing reality. So he's saying, when he says evaluative, he means most of the time when people say racist, they mean racist, like you're a meanie, you're a bad racist, and they never mean objective observer of racial differences. Racism is a Janus word, whose evaluative face predominates. Calling someone or something racist automatically condemns him or it. In fact, the fierce emotions accompanying racism suggest that its core meaning is grossly improper race consciousness. Yet at the same time, the word racism is freely used for an enormous range of beliefs, attitudes, and practices, many of which seem in no way grossly improper, or improper at all. That is why the word serves only to obscure. The chief problem the word creates is that of begged questions. Precisely because racist things are bad by definition, it is tempting to try to force condemnation of an attitude or practice by labeling it racist, when in point of logic, the attitude or practice in question must first be shown to be bad by some independent standard before it can be so labeled. In legal language, racism is conclusory and cannot be used as a premise. Yet, because incessant denunciations of racism has made the epithet unchallengeable, that is often just how it is used. Natural Janus words, which inherit their evaluative force from a social consensus about the value of their reference, do not lend themselves to this kind of abuse. Since everyone agrees and is known to agree about what sort of butter is fit to eat, no one would try to condemn perfectly fresh butter by calling it rancid. But racism, as currently used, did not inherit its negative force from a universal dislike of its referent. It might once have denoted Hitlerian racial beliefs, while also encoding rejection of those beliefs, and when it did, less egregious racial offenses were called bigotry or prejudice. In that usage, racism was a systematic theory. This theory entailed certain attitudes and modes of behavior, but those attitudes and behaviors did not by themselves constitute racism. By contrast, today's racism was coined for the purpose of condemnation, in part by summoning up emotions evoked by the old word, and for the condemnation of anything belonging to almost any category. I trust the reader will agree that all he can conclude when he hears racist employed today is that its referent is something to do with race that the speaker dislikes. Racism is not so much uttered as shouted. Its conversational function is to shut conversation down. This torrent of unpleasantness saturates whatever the word is attached to, however arbitrary the attachment. What has created an aversion to racism is less disapproval of what the word denotes than a wish to avoid anti-racist wrath. This reminds me of a good meme. I'm going to put it on the screen for a few seconds. If you're anti-racist, you're just virtue signaling. And it's ironic because you think you're signaling positive virtue, but actually you're signaling a lack of virtue. You have no balls, you have no courage, you have no conviction, you don't use logic. You're not a better person, you're a worse person. You're a conformist and you're a coward, and it's pathetic. Calling claims of genetic race differences racist, in particular, begs not one, but four questions. Number one, are race differences in themselves bad? Number two, is believing in race differences bad? Number three, is saying there are race differences bad? And number four, is studying race differences bad? Once it is realized that an affirmative answer to each of these questions must be established before the charge of racism can be made to stick, the charge itself collapses. Consider question 1 first. Race differences, as facts of nature, have no moral dimension. They either exist or do not exist. Reality may frustrate our wishes, but it is not in itself bad or good. Since a thing must be bad to be racist, race differences, if they exist, are not racist. The only challenge I can think of to this seeming truism is the contention that facts about race or society, or the world in general, do not exist apart from belief in them, but rather are socially constructed, that is, exist only insofar as we believe in and value them. The quickest way with such Berkeleyan idealism is to observe that if all facts about race are constructed, so must be the fact that anyone believes in race differences. On the constructionist theory, there are hereditarians only because there are people who believe in and talk as if there were hereditarians. Were this so, constructionists could end belief in race differences merely by ceasing to believe and convincing others to cease believing that anyone believes in race differences. Their constant invocations against racism shows that not even constructionists themselves take the theory seriously. Turning to number 2, factual beliefs in themselves are merely true or false, not good or evil. Therefore, belief in race differences cannot, in itself, be racist. The motives for holding such beliefs may be bad. Some people may believe whites more intelligent than blacks from a desire to find blacks inferior. But there is nothing wrong with believing in race differences from respectable motives, such as intellectual persuasion. Precisely the same assessment applies to assertions which, like beliefs, are merely true or false, not good or bad. A maliciously motivated act of asserting that blacks are less intelligent than whites may be bad, and possibly racist, but I have repeatedly pointed out good reasons for making this assertion, such as a desire for justice. Calling attention to race differences, considered apart from the motives for doing so, is not inherently racist, in the negative sense. Finally, research into race differences is bad and potentially racist only if driven by bad motives, such as active enjoyment of humiliating blacks. But, once again, such research can just as easily be driven by good motives, such as curiosity or a desire for justice. So, research into race differences is not in itself racist. If you assume that someone who is interested in race differences is only interested in doing so for the need to feel superior, or so that they can humiliate people below them in some way, that really says more about you than about the person that you're condemning. I'm not making this audiobook to humiliate anybody. Do you think I might have another motivation, a more honorable one? Could you give me the benefit of the doubt? Well, you probably wouldn't be listening if you didn't give me the benefit of the doubt, but I know some haters have listened to some of the videos, and it's pretty pathetic, some of the assumptions they make and some of the motivations they ascribe to me without knowing anything about me. Many people grudgingly admit that discussing race differences may not be inherently bad, but warn that it risks bad consequences, including distress to blacks and encouragement of hate. The question is then whether blindness to these possibilities is so negligent and insensitive as to be racist. This is a matter of judgment, of course, but a strong case can be made against the racism verdict. After all, frank discussion of almost any important issue is bound to offend somebody. Talking about evolution bothers religious fundamentalists, yet is morally permitted. And how sensitive must one be to avoid being called a racist? To judge from their blanket condemnation of all talk of race differences, many people accept only silence as adequate, turning sensitivity into a demand for self-censorship. All told, racism is so strong a word that only active malevolence can merit it, not unintentional disregard of black feelings. So when he says some people will only accept silence as adequate, that's not even true anymore. You used to have to just shut up to not be considered racist, but now you have to be an anti-racist. You have to speak up about how racist white people are and how bad. You can't just be silent, you have to be unsilent. And let's not forget that certified hood classic slogan, silence is violence, or as sometimes they would phrase it, white silence is violence. Because as we all know, if you don't talk about the non-existent genocide of black people in America by whites, you are a violent person, you are responsible for Black Death. I could kind of understand using this phrase. Sometimes it's true, maybe in relation to the Palestinian situation. If Americans are silent about that, they're kind of complicit. But that's an actual genocide that's happening. It's very different from the showering with welfare and gifts and opportunities that is happening to blacks in America. Furthermore, blacks assault whites far more often than whites assault blacks, but you never hear white people complaining that blacks don't speak up about the people in their own community who are being so violent. We never say, black silence is violence, do we? No, because we're not retarded. And we don't think something is clever or true just because it rhymes. That empirical beliefs cannot be criticized on moral grounds may have eluded Jaynes and Williams 1989, who say, quote, "For some people, racism means any form of race recognition, especially instances in which members of privileged groups act in a manner injurious to a disadvantaged group. Others, however, reserve the term for patterns of belief and related actions that overtly embrace the notion of genetic or biological differences between groups. Still others use the term to designate feelings of cultural superiority. We use the term racism to denote biological racism, as in the second interpretation above. Societal racism, borrowing from Frederickson 1971, is used to denote negative racial attitudes or outcomes that lack a clear basis in a belief in inherently racial inferiority. Mere recognition of social groups based on racial characteristics is not treated here as a form of racism, but as being race-conscious. Cultural preferences that do not include systematic ranking of social groups and clear hostility toward outgroups is termed ethnocentrism. The concept of racism, however, qualified and defined, involves a value judgment. Racism of whatever variety is undesirable. Racist outcomes are wrong, and people who advocate racist ideas are typically viewed as being morally deficient, if not dangerous." End quote. So, you should be calling me ethnocentrist, not racist. Since they identify racism with the notion of genetic or biological differences between groups, an ostensibly factual belief, Jaynes and Williams have at first glance so defined it as to avoid a value judgment. But they immediately add that racism does involve a value judgment, and is, moreover, undesirable. They do not, it is true, infer the biological identity of all groups from the undesirable racist character of believing otherwise. Rather, they bury the factual issue beneath an avalanche of pejoratives. Wrong, morally deficient, and dangerous. Jaynes and Williams' foray into semantics illustrates the conflict between the negative connotation of racism and its chosen referent. The repeated occurrence of this clash within commonly offered definitions suggests that no coherent definition of racism is possible, and the word is consequently unusable. Which is why, anytime anyone calls anyone racist these days, they just get laughed at by most reasonable people, because it's become meaningless. That's like Newtsy. Many people would adopt the third definition mentioned in the citation from Jaynes and Williams, namely that racism is belief in racial superiority. The first point to make about this proposal is that it spares the belief that whites are more intelligent and self-restrained than blacks, for intelligence and time preference are empirically defined traits whose ascription implies no value judgment. One may well value intelligence and self-restraint, and anyone who does so, while also believing that whites typically possess these traits to a greater degree than blacks, is committed to believing that whites typically possess more of something valuable. But the belief that whites are more intelligent than blacks does not, by itself, imply this, so it is not racist in the sense now under consideration. In any event, the definition is unsatisfactory. It takes belief in the superiority of one race to another to be inherently bad, whereas, or so I argue in Chapter 7, such beliefs are typically operationalized as factual beliefs. As factual beliefs are not good or bad per se, operationalized judgments of racial superiority are not good or bad either. Moreover, as we will also see, these beliefs are supported by the evidence, and probably accepted by the reader. So, since there is nothing wrong with accepting reasonable beliefs, they do not deserve to be stigmatized. Indeed, there seems nothing inherently wrong with thinking one's own group better in a frankly cheerleading sense. Most individuals experience this impulse, and when black-white comparisons are not at issue, it is considered healthy. I am not talking of venomous emotions like hatred, but the feeling that British is best, or the vicarious satisfaction that many Jews take in the number of Jewish Nobel laureates, and other forms of ethnic pride. Misplaced vicarious pride, but anyway. Racists, quote, are typically viewed as being morally deficient, if not dangerous, end quote, say Janes and Williams. Yet an American who thinks the Japanese are crazy to risk their lives eating fugu is not dangerous, nor is a German calmly citing Beethoven to prove the superiority of German culture morally deficient. It is hard to see why these attitudes are bad enough to be considered racist. Now the fact is that, whether or not they should, most people do value intelligence, so the statement that blacks are typically less intelligent than whites, no matter how intended, is usually perceived as derogatory. And while unflattering beliefs about groups held on good grounds are acceptable, what of stereotypers who hold such beliefs because they want to and use evidence selectively to confirm what they want to believe? Defining racism as the desire that blacks lack highly valued traits captures how such people think, and as this desire is unattractive, it appears consistent with the negative force of racism. I don't want blacks to be less intelligent. I really wish they weren't. That would make life so much better for everybody. I wouldn't have to be doing this project. I could be doing something else. But that's the way it is, so deal with it. Yet this definition too is unsatisfactory. For one thing, while racism is commonly said to pervade American society, there is relatively little racism in this sense. Once bad motives are required, negative beliefs stemming from observation rather than hostility are excluded. Unconscious and institutional racism become contradictions in terms. If your racism is unconscious, then it's not racism, because you have to have negative beliefs about someone which would be conscious. Finally, and less apt to be noticed, there are many non-invidious, hence non-racist, reasons for wanting blacks to have disvalued traits. Whites may hope for a genetic black IQ deficit to absolve them of guilt for black failure, just as any defendant in a liability suit hopes the plaintiff's case will unravel. Or else, whites may be indulging the understandable impulse to resist those who willfully personalize every disagreement. It is human nature to oppose whatever the office blowhard is for, and whites, weary of blame for every black failure, naturally want the blame mongers shown up by the existence of innate black shortcomings. These impulses are not bad, let alone racist. I think that describes me pretty well. I'm sick of being blamed for shit that isn't my fault, and it's nice to have an explanation. And just because that absolves me, that doesn't make it untrue. Just because that is one of my motivations, that doesn't make me wrong in the intellectual or moral sense. Similar problems face the broader definition of racism as hatred of racial groups other than one's own. Without denying the existence or corrosiveness of race hatred, this attitude must be distinguished from numerous milder ones. Hatred implies a desire to destroy, yet just as it is possible to sneer at pro wrestling fans or readers of supermarket tabloids without hating them, it is possible to dislike black music without wanting it banned, or dislike the black personal style and wish to avoid blacks altogether without wanting to see blacks suffer. One may avoid black neighborhoods for fear of crime while sympathizing with black victims of black criminals. None of these feelings are racist if racism implies hatred, yet anyone who confesses distaste for black music or admits wishing to minimize contact with blacks will surely be branded racist. Those who bandy about the term racism in this way use it too broadly to mean race hatred. Good point. The word racism is stretched to its snapping point when defined, as it often is, as, quote, treatment of individuals on the basis of their race, end quote. More so than any other, This definition is too sweeping to support the negative overtones of, quote, racism, and condemns legitimate practices virtually by word magic. There is nothing obviously wrong with sending Asian policemen to infiltrate Asian gangs, or casting a white woman as Desdemona, or preferring to marry someone of one's own race, all counted as racist by this definition. A few writers have tried to salvage the word by neutralizing it, defining it as race consciousness of any sort, while dropping the axiom that all forms of racism are bad. That sounds like something I would do. Dinesh D'Souza's term, rational racism, is a stab at neutrality. Such attempts are unlikely to succeed, in my view, for the pejorative connotations of racism have become too deeply entrenched. In fact, contemporary discourse combines the worst of both worlds, using the neutral and the pejorative senses of racism often in the same breath. The unfortunate result is guilt by equivocation. Something is labeled racist in the neutral sense. There is a switch to the pejorative sense, and what is innocent stands condemned. One victim of this gambit was Dale Lick, a candidate for the presidency of Michigan State University. Years prior to his candidacy for president, he had said, in relation to the recruitment of basketball players, quote, "A black athlete can actually outjump a white athlete, so they're better at the game. All you need to do is turn to the NCAA playoffs in basketball to see that the bulk of the players on those outstanding teams are black." End quote. Sounds like a compliment to me, but let's see what happens to the guy. Once made public, this remark and Lick himself were instantly branded racist, and Lick was denied the job. This guy's life, I wouldn't say ruined, but severely altered for the negative just by observing that black people can jump higher. Which, once again, is a compliment. I wish I could jump higher. I'm jealous of black jumping ability. I'm not jealous of some other things. I certainly wouldn't trade places just to jump higher, and I used to be able to jump very high. For a white person, I could dunk. I was the only person in my high school that could dunk. So, I was a high jumper and on track. Anyway, moving on. Speaking of being on track, let's get back on track. All right. His statement had indeed been racist in the neutral sense. It was a generalization about race, but not racist in the bad sense, since there seems nothing wrong with citing well-known facts about basketball or anything else in aid of a conclusion they support. Yet Lick's statement was treated as racist in the bad sense. Janes and Williams write, quote, "Many people question any scholarly use of this concept because it is so manifestly value-laden," end quote. A question very much in order. The elasticity of racism permits denunciation of virtually anything, including whites doing on Tuesday what was demanded of them on Monday. Ignoring the racial impact of higher academic standards for college athletes is racist, but so is noting the racial composition of college basketball teams. It is racist to treat black executives as if they are special, and racist to forget their isolation. Media coverage of slum crime is racist, yet the media turning a blind eye to slum crime is racist indifference to black victims. Too few police in black slums is also indifference, while more police, when white, are an occupying army, or, when black, are Uncle Toms. It is racist to overlook the deprived upbringing of black criminals, and racist to insult the spiritual richness of black life by pointing out these deprivations. Failure to act decisively against drugs lest they ravage the black community is racist. Treating drug dealers harshly is an assault on black males. Movie and TV depictions of blacks as jive-talking pimps are racist, but so are sugar-coated depictions of blacks as middle class. Racist colonial powers exploited tribal rivalries in Africa, and racist colonial powers imposed the European concept of nationhood on rivalrous tribes. It is racist to say that black children differ cognitively from white children, and racist to ignore the black learning style. In other words, you can't win. No matter what you do, you're racist. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Doing away with the term racism will not by itself end such nonsense, but nonsense is easier to spot when divested of verbal camouflage. There would remain the problem of labeling the position that race differences exist and are important determinants of human affairs. Christopher Brand, 1996, has suggested using the term racial realism. The important obligation is removal of verbal obstacles to clarity. End of chapter 5. There's just one footnote out of the 16 here that I want to read. Number 12. There may also be gene-environment interaction, as exogenous public assistance cancels the negative consequences of destructive behavior, further disinhibiting destructive impulses. So basically, welfare, far from helping black people, actually hurts them because it makes it easier for them to be lazy crackheads, basically. See you in chapter 6.